The Moretti estate was a masterpiece of architecture, a sprawling testament to wealth, power, and above all, control. Every hallway, every polished marble floor, every carefully placed painting reflected the meticulous precision of its owner, Adrian Moretti. To the outside world, Adrian was the very embodiment of success, a billionaire with a keen business mind, a man who had built an empire from the ground up. But to those who worked inside the estate, Adrian was known for something else, his unrelenting need to orchestrate every detail of his life, and by extension, the lives of everyone around him. There was no room for chaos, no tolerance for surprises. Everything operated according to his rules, his schedules, his expectations. This was especially true after the death of his wife, an event that had only reinforced his obsession with order. Grief, after all, was messy and unpredictable, two things Adrian could not abide. His solution was to bury himself in work and structure his son's life with the same rigid precision that governed his own. Matteo Moretti, his 13-year-old son, had grown up within these carefully drawn lines. Since his mother's passing, Matteo had retreated further into himself with each passing year. Adrian, convinced that shielding Matteo from emotional turbulence was the best path forward, provided him with every material comfort but little else. Tutors, books, state-of-the-art technology, Matteo had everything except the freedom to explore who he really was. The silence between father and son stretched longer each day, filled only with polite exchanges and occasional questions about schoolwork. To Adrian, this was a sign that the system was working. No tantrums, no outbursts, just calm compliance. What he failed to notice was how small Matteo's world had become, how joy had quietly slipped away, leaving behind only routines and quiet resignation. That was why the sight that met Adrian's eyes one ordinary afternoon shook him to his core. Passing by the large glass windows overlooking the garden, he glimpsed something so out of place it made him stop mid-step. There, in the middle of the sunlit lawn, was Matteo dancing. The boy moved awkwardly at times, his steps hesitant and unsure, but there was no mistaking the joy radiating from his face. For the first time in years, Matteo was smiling, really smiling, not the polite, fleeting curve of his lips Adrian was accustomed to, but a wide, carefree grin that lit up his whole face. And next to him, moving with grace and purpose, was Danielle Carter, the estate's cook, a woman Adrian had barely noticed in the 6 months since she'd been hired. Danielle was guiding Matteo's movements with the precision of someone who knew exactly what she was doing. There was nothing casual about her posture or her steps. This wasn't playful improvisation, it was structured, intentional, the kind of instruction that only came from years of training. Adrian's initial shock gave way to something darker: irritation, even a flicker of resentment. Who was this woman to step into his son's life, to offer something Adrian himself hadn't known Matteo wanted? How had this happened right under his nose? The longer he stood watching, the more his unease grew. The father in him felt displaced, as though an uninvited guest had slipped into the space between him and his son. Adrian prided himself on knowing everything that happened within his walls, and yet here was proof that he had missed something vital. Worse still, the laughter and connection between Matteo and Danielle hinted at a bond that had formed beyond his control. The sound of his own footsteps against the stone path shattered the moment. As Adrian approached, Matteo froze, his joy instantly replaced by the guarded tension of a child awaiting reprimand. Danielle, however, remained calm, wiping her hands on her apron before meeting Adrian's gaze with unwavering composure. Her lack of deference grated on him. When Adrian's voice broke the silence, cool, clipped, demanding an explanation, it was Danielle, not Matteo, who answered. Her response was simple: he wanted to learn. There was no apology in her tone, no attempt to justify or soften the truth. Adrian's interrogation continued, but each answer only deepened his discomfort. Matteo hadn't asked his father for help because he assumed Adrian would say no, or worse, dismiss the desire entirely. And when no one else was willing to listen, Danielle had. That brief exchange marked the beginning of a shift Adrian could neither predict nor control. Standing there in the garden, surrounded by the orderly beauty he had so carefully curated, Adrian was confronted with the messiness of real life, the unpredictable desires of a grieving child, the quiet strength of a woman who refused to be invisible, and the harsh realization that his own son had found joy not in the things Adrian provided, but in the one thing he'd overlooked, the freedom to dance. Adrian Moretti had always assumed that he knew his son inside and out. After all, he had been there every step of the way through the funeral, the therapists, the gradual silencing of laughter, and the slow retreat into books and solitary hobbies. Matteo Moretti, 13 years old, was a quiet boy, serious beyond his years, molded by grief and shaped by his father's belief that structure would protect him from pain. Adrian believed that if he removed unnecessary distractions and gave his son clear expectations, Matteo would be safe not just from the world, but from his own vulnerability. Yet all those assumptions crumbled the moment Adrian saw Matteo dancing in the garden. It was a perfectly ordinary day. Adrian's mind had been occupied with meetings, investments, and the endless demands of his business empire. Walking through his house, he glanced out the window without thinking until his brain processed what his eyes were seeing, and his footsteps faltered. There was Matteo, arms slightly outstretched, his feet attempting delicate movements across the grass. There was hesitation in his steps, a stiffness that came from being both self-conscious and inexperienced. Yet, despite his lack of skill, there was no mistaking the joy radiating from his face. It was a joy Adrian hadn't seen in years, not since before his mother's death. And standing beside Matteo, gently correcting his posture and demonstrating each step with effortless grace, was Danielle Carter, the estate's cook. The shock of seeing them together was almost as jarring as the act itself. Danielle was someone Adrian had barely acknowledged since she was hired. To him, she was part of the background, a functional presence responsible for meals and nothing more. He had no idea she even knew his son, let alone that they shared some kind of private bond. Yet here she was, her movements precise, her corrections gentle but firm, the easy rapport between them undeniable. Matteo wasn't just dancing, he was learning, and more importantly, he was laughing. Adrian couldn't remember the last time he had heard his son laugh with such abandon. The sound was so unfamiliar, it was almost foreign. It unsettled him in a way that went beyond mere surprise. A knot of irritation formed in Adrian's chest as he stood watching. He didn't like that someone else, especially a household employee, had such influence over his son. It wasn't jealousy, exactly. Adrian wasn't the type to crave emotional closeness, but it felt like a breach of some invisible boundary. He was the parent. It was his role to shape his son's life, to determine what was appropriate and what was not. And yet, Matteo had sought out Danielle, had trusted her with this fragile, hidden desire to dance something he had never even mentioned to his own father. The realization stung, though Adrian couldn't immediately name why. The longer Adrian stood there, the more uncomfortable he became. Danielle was not just humoring a bored child. Her movements, her corrections, her posture, they all spoke of training, experience, and a depth of knowledge that had no place in a household kitchen. Every step she demonstrated carried the polish of someone who had once lived and breathed the art of dance. It was clear this was not playful improvisation, but true instruction, the kind that required both skill and patience. That was the moment when suspicion began to bloom. Who was Danielle Carter, really? Why was she here, in his kitchen, when she clearly belonged somewhere else? And why had his son's first real joy in years come from her? With each passing second, Adrian's unease grew into something closer to resentment. This was his house, his son, his carefully constructed world. Yet somehow, he had been blind to something essential, something that had been happening right under his roof. It was an affront to his sense of control, but more than that, it was a reminder of just how little he really knew about the boy living in his home. Matteo had dreams, desires, and fears that Adrian had never asked about. And when those unspoken needs went unmet, Matteo had turned to the one person who had bothered to listen, someone Adrian had dismissed as invisible. By the time Adrian forced himself to step outside and interrupt the lesson, the damage was already done. Matteo's face instantly fell at the sound of his father's approaching footsteps, the carefree laughter vanishing like mist in the morning sun. But Danielle didn't flinch. She simply wiped her hands on her apron and met Adrian's gaze without hesitation. That simple act, meeting his eyes as an equal rather than a subordinate, was enough to stoke his irritation further. But underneath the frustration, there was something else. A flicker of doubt, a gnawing question that wouldn't leave him. How much had he missed, and how much more was hidden beneath the surface? In that moment, Adrian Moretti realized that his perfectly ordered life was not nearly as controlled as he thought, and for the first time in a long time, he felt afraid. Adrian Moretti was not a man who left questions unanswered. In the boardroom, in his estate, in every corner of his meticulously ordered world, he prided himself on knowing every variable, every risk, and every potential threat. Ignorance was a weakness he couldn't afford, not in business, and certainly not within the walls of his own home. That was why, after the scene in the garden, Adrian found himself standing in the doorway of the kitchen, watching Danielle Carter as she calmly wiped down the marble countertops. The woman who, until today, had been little more than part of the scenery, now stood at the center of a puzzle Adrian was determined to solve. Danielle glanced up as he entered, her expression composed but guarded. There was no trace of the woman who had just been twirling across the lawn with his son, no hint of the effortless grace he'd seen only minutes earlier. Here, she was simply the cook, efficient, invisible, exactly as she was supposed to be. But Adrian knew better now. He stepped further into the room, his polished shoes clicking against the tile, and without preamble, placed his phone on the counter between them. The screen displayed an article faded, years old, but unmistakable. The headline read, "Rising ballet star disappears at the peak of her career." Beneath the headline was a photo, a younger version of Danielle, poised in a perfect arabesque, her face serene, her arms weightless. He watched her reaction closely. A flicker of surprise crossed her features, there for only a heartbeat before her composure returned. "Care to explain this?" Adrian's voice was low, clipped, the tone of a man used to getting answers. For a moment, Danielle said nothing. She glanced down at the photo, her fingers brushing the edge of the phone, and when she finally spoke, her voice was measured but quiet. "You've been searching for me." It wasn't a question. Adrian folded his arms across his chest. "I don't like mysteries in my house," he said, "especially when they involve my son." Danielle exhaled slowly, setting aside the dish towel she had been holding, as though shedding a protective layer. For a moment, he thought she might refuse to answer. But then, with a quiet resignation, she said, "I suppose I should have expected this. You're not the type to leave things alone." She looked at the photo again, her eyes distant, as though seeing the ghost of the person she used to be. "I was a dancer," she said simply. "A long time ago." Adrian's brow arched. "You were more than a dancer," he corrected. "You were a star." A brittle smile tugged at the corner of her mouth. A star that burned out before it could shine, she said softly. Adrian waited, offering no sympathy, only silence, the kind of silence that demanded more. Danielle took a breath, her gaze fixed on the far wall. "I had a fiancé," she said. "Adrian. We trained together. We were supposed to tour the world, two kids from nowhere, with nothing but talent and a dream." Her voice faltered, just for a moment. "The day before our first major performance, Adrian was hit by a car. He died instantly." The words hung in the air, heavy and absolute. Adrian didn't speak. There was nothing to say to that. Grief was something he understood, even if he dealt with it differently. "After that," Danielle continued, "I couldn't dance. I couldn't hear music without feeling like the ground had been ripped out from under me. So I disappeared." She glanced at him then, her eyes challenging him to judge her weakness. But Adrian felt no victory in her vulnerability, only a cold understanding. He knew what it meant to lose someone so deeply entwined with your sense of self. "So you became a cook," he said, not unkindly. Danielle let out a soft laugh, though there was no humor in it. "I needed something safe, something practical, something that didn't hurt." Adrian leaned back slightly, processing her story. It explained much: her precision, her poise, the grace that had no place in a kitchen, but somehow belonged to her nonetheless. But it didn't explain why she had broken her own self-imposed exile for Matteo. "Why teach him?" he asked. "Why now?" Her expression softened. "Because he reminds me of myself," she said. "A kid with too much weight on his shoulders. Someone who's forgotten how to smile." The words hit harder than Adrian expected. He had built a fortress around his son, believing it would protect him. Instead, it had trapped him. Danielle had seen what Adrian had missed, and worse, she had offered Matteo something Adrian hadn't known how to give. Adrian turned slightly, his jaw tight with unspoken frustration, not at Danielle, but at himself. For all his control, for all his money and power, it had taken a stranger to see his son clearly. And for the first time, Adrian wondered whether control had ever truly meant security, or if it had only ever been a way to hide from the things he couldn't bear to face. The next morning, the transformation began. The carefully maintained silence of the Moretti estate gave way to the rhythmic sound of footsteps, the echo of sharp corrections, and the steady repetition of music. In the center of it all stood Matteo Moretti, his brow damp with sweat, his young face set with a determination Adrian had never seen in him before. Across from him, Danielle Carter had shed her apron and the quiet anonymity of her role as cook. In its place stood someone else entirely, a mentor, a dancer, a woman who knew exactly what it meant to demand perfection. Her soft-spoken demeanor had vanished, replaced with the firm, precise authority of someone who had spent years pushing herself past the limits of exhaustion. "Again," she said, her voice calm but unyielding, each correction delivered without unnecessary praise or apology. Matteo obeyed without question, his body moving in time with her commands. His arms lifted, his posture adjusted, his feet slid across the polished floor in a relentless pursuit of grace. There were no shortcuts, no indulgences. Every time he missed a step, Danielle was there not to comfort, but to correct, to guide him back into position until it became second nature. The physical strain was visible, but something in Matteo's expression had changed. Gone was the hesitation, the fear of failure. In its place was something sharper, a quiet defiance, a hunger to prove not just to Danielle, but to himself that he was capable. From the doorway, Adrian Moretti watched, arms folded tightly across his chest. His instinct was to intervene, to question whether this was too much for a boy who had never been pushed in this way before. But he held his tongue. Danielle's methods were harsh by any measure, but they were not cruel. Every correction was deliberate, purposeful, and grounded in respect for Matteo's potential. It was a language Adrian recognized, not the coddling of a well-meaning teacher, but the demanding clarity of a coach who saw the spark of talent and refused to let it fade into mediocrity. And, to Adrian's surprise, Matteo responded to it. Hours stretched into days and days into weeks. The estate's formal dining room, once a place for quiet meals and sterile conversation, became a training ground. The ornate chandeliers cast light over stretched limbs, faltering spins, and moments of quiet frustration followed by breakthroughs. Danielle pushed Matteo further each day, raising the bar with each passing session. There was no sugarcoating, no empty encouragements, only honest feedback and the expectation that Matteo would rise to meet it. Adrian found himself drawn to these sessions, a silent observer on the edges of the room. It was not just Matteo's growing skill that captivated him, but the transformation happening within his son. Matteo, who had once been so afraid of failure that he rarely took risks, now fell and got back up without hesitation. He grimaced through sore muscles, pushed past frustration, and demanded more from himself with each repetition. There was pride in his posture now, a sense of ownership over the process and the progress he was making. For the first time in years, Adrian saw his son fight for something. There were no shortcuts in Danielle's training, no allowances for fear, but there was something else, something Adrian had rarely seen in his own world of ruthless ambition care. Danielle's corrections were firm, but they were never dismissive. She saw Matteo's effort, his frustration, his triumphs, and she acknowledged them in quiet ways, a brief nod when he nailed a difficult sequence, a small smile when he corrected his own mistake before she could point it out. It wasn't praise, exactly, but it was recognition, and it was enough to fuel Matteo's drive. As the tournament drew closer, the training intensified, but so did Matteo's resolve. Adrian watched it all with a strange mix of pride and unease. His son was no longer the quiet, cautious boy hiding behind books and routines. He was something else now, someone who had discovered not just a passion, but a sense of self worth fighting for. And for the first time, Adrian began to understand that his role wasn't to control that transformation, but to step aside and let it happen. The day of the competition arrived with a quiet tension that settled over the Moretti estate like an early morning fog. For weeks, the once silent halls had echoed with music, sharp corrections, and the steady repetition of movements until they became muscle memory. Now, those weeks of sweat and sacrifice would be tested on a stage far beyond the comfort of home. Matteo Moretti, dressed in sleek competition attire, stood backstage at the Grand Theatre, his hands trembling slightly as he adjusted the straps of his dance shoes. The murmur of other competitors filled the air, blending with the hum of anticipation and the occasional burst of nervous laughter. Somewhere among the crowd was Carlos Mendoza, the reigning champion, and the boy Matteo had heard so much about the dancer who had won the title 2 years in a row and made sure to remind Matteo, through taunting messages, that he didn't belong here. From a few feet away, Adrian Moretti stood watching his son, his posture rigid, his expression unreadable. This was unfamiliar ground for Adrian. There were no profit margins to calculate, no negotiations to steer, no data to predict the outcome. For the first time in a long time, control was entirely out of his hands. All he could do was watch and wait. Danielle Carter, standing beside Matteo, placed a steadying hand on his shoulder. "Breathe," she said softly. "You've done the work. Now you dance." Her voice held no doubt, only quiet confidence, and somehow it was enough. Matteo exhaled slowly, his fingers unclenching just a bit. The announcer's voice rang through the speakers, calling Matteo's name. His heart thudded in his chest as he stepped onto the stage, the bright lights temporarily blinding him. For a brief second, doubt clawed at him. What if he forgot the steps? What if he failed? What if Carlos had been right all along? Then he saw them, In the front row, his father sat with his hands clasped, his gaze locked on Matteo with an intensity that was not critical, but something steadier, something almost protective. Next to him, Danielle gave a slight nod, her expression calm, as if to say, "You belong here." The music began, and for the first time, Matteo let go of the fear. His body moved before his mind could overthink, every step flowing into the next, every turn infused with the hours of practice that had built a foundation beneath his feet. He danced not for a trophy, not to prove anyone wrong, but because it felt right. For the first time in years, he wasn't just following someone else's rules, he was telling his own story. The final sequence loomed, the spin and leap that had haunted him through weeks of training. His muscles tensed, remembering every correction Danielle had drilled into him. He braced, leapt, and for one breathless moment, time seemed to hold still. Then he landed, light and steady. The music stopped, silence. Then applause, thunderous, relentless, filling the theater and washing over him like a wave. The results came soon after. Carlos Mendoza retained his crown, his smirk as polished as his footwork. But then came an unexpected announcement, a special award for artistic expression, recognizing not just technical precision, but passion, heart, and the ability to tell a story through movement. The recipient, Matteo Moretti. The crowd cheered again, but Matteo could only blink in surprise as the medal was placed around his neck. It wasn't first place, but it was something just as powerful, a recognition of his journey, his courage, and the voice he had found in his own body. Outside the theater, Adrian placed a hand on Matteo's shoulder. "How do you feel?" he asked. Matteo looked down at the medal, then back up at his father. "Proud," he said simply. And for the first time, Adrian felt it too. The ride home from the competition was quieter than expected. There was no loud celebration, no triumphant chants or dramatic exclamations. Matteo Moretti sat in the back seat, his fingers still curled loosely around the medal for artistic expression hanging from his neck. The weight of it felt both unfamiliar and deeply personal, a symbol of how far he had come, not just as a dancer, but as a boy who had once hidden himself behind books and silence. In the front seat, Adrian Moretti drove, glancing at his son in the rearview mirror from time to time. For years, their car rides had been filled with awkward silence, short exchanges about school or chores, nothing more. But something was different now. The silence between them wasn't uncomfortable anymore, it was full, weighted with unspoken understanding. Adrian had always believed that his role as a father was to provide, to create structure, offer security, and shield Matteo from unnecessary risk. In his mind, safety was the ultimate gift a parent could give, especially after the sudden loss of Matteo's mother. Yet, as he watched his son tonight, still flushed from exertion, the medal glinting softly in the dim light, Adrian realized that safety had never been enough. His desire to protect Matteo from pain had only built walls around the boy, trapping him in a life too small for his spirit. The quiet child who had once seemed so content was never content at all. He had simply been waiting for someone to listen. That someone had not been Adrian. It had been Danielle Carter, the cook who had quietly stepped into their lives and seen what Adrian had been too blind or too afraid to see. Where Adrian had offered rules, Danielle had offered possibility. Where Adrian had shielded Matteo from risk, Danielle had encouraged him to leap into the unknown. And somehow, by trusting her, Matteo had started to trust himself. That realization humbled Adrian in ways he couldn't fully articulate. Control had always been his greatest strength, the foundation upon which he had built his wealth, his reputation, his identity as a man who always knew the right move. But now, watching his son shine, Adrian wondered if control had also been his greatest weakness. The transformation in Matteo was impossible to ignore. The boy who used to walk with his head down now stood taller, not just in posture, but in spirit. There was pride in the way he carried himself, not arrogance, but the quiet confidence of someone who had discovered his own worth. Failure hadn't broken him, it had shaped him. Losing to Carlos Mendoza wasn't the end, it was only the beginning. A challenge Mateo was already determined to face again. And in that newfound sense of purpose, Adrian saw something remarkable. His son wasn't just surviving anymore, he was living. Later that night, as they stood in the kitchen, Mateo turned to his father. "Can I keep training?" His voice was calm, but there was hope there too. A hope Adrian knew he couldn't afford to crush. "Of course," Adrian said, the words coming easier than expected. "We're just getting started." Mateo's smile was quick, bright, and utterly genuine, the kind of smile Adrian hadn't seen since his wife was alive. It was a reminder of everything they had lost, but also of everything they could still build together. As Adrian watched his son disappear down the hall, he knew that his own transformation had only just begun. Letting go of control wasn't weakness, it was love. And for the first time, Adrian Moretti understood that the greatest gift he could give his son wasn't protection. It was the freedom to discover who he was meant to be. For most of his life, Adrian Moretti had believed that success was built on control. Control over his business empire, control over his household, and most importantly, control over his son's life. After losing his wife, Adrian's grip on that control had only tightened, convinced that order and structure were the only ways to protect Mateo from further pain. Emotions were unpredictable, dreams were fragile, passion led to disappointment. Adrian had built a fortress around his son, mistaking protection for love and silence for stability. But watching Mateo on that stage, dancing with a freedom and joy that no amount of structure could ever produce, Adrian realized just how wrong he had been. The most valuable lesson came not from any deal Adrian had ever closed or any strategy he had mastered, but from his own son. Mateo's journey from a quiet, withdrawn boy to a determined young dancer wasn't about medals or competitions. It was about rediscovering his own voice, a voice that had been buried beneath grief and Adrian's well-meaning but suffocating expectations. Through dance, Mateo found a way to express emotions too big for words, reconnecting with the parts of himself that Adrian had tried so hard to shield. In doing so, Mateo taught his father something Adrian had spent his whole life avoiding: that vulnerability isn't weakness, and that true strength comes from embracing uncertainty, not shutting it out. Danielle Carter, who had once been a nameless employee in Adrian's perfectly ordered world, became the unexpected catalyst for this transformation. Her own story of loss and resilience gave her the wisdom to see what Adrian could not: that healing doesn't come from avoidance, but from facing the things that hurt most. By sharing her love of dance with Mateo, Danielle didn't just teach him steps and routines, she gave him back the belief that joy was possible, even after heartbreak. And in doing so, she opened Adrian's eyes to the truth he had been too afraid to face. His son didn't need perfection. He needed permission to live fully, to fail, to succeed, to discover who he was beyond the walls of grief and expectation. In the end, the dance competition wasn't about winning. It wasn't even about proving anything to Carlos Mendoza or anyone else. It was about Mateo proving to himself that he was worthy, not because he was the best, but because he was brave enough to show up, to try, and to keep going. As Adrian stood beside his son after the competition, the weight of the medal around Mateo's neck paled in comparison to the pride shining in his eyes. For the first time in years, Adrian wasn't proud because of an achievement. He was proud because his son was finally free. The journey wasn't over for either of them. But now, Adrian understood that his role was not to lead or control that journey. It was simply to walk beside Mateo, ready to catch him if he fell and cheer him on when he soared. Life has a way of teaching us lessons we never expected, often through the people we least expect. The story of Adrian and his son Matteo is not just about dance, it's about rediscovery, healing, and the power of letting go. As we grow older, it becomes all too easy to believe that control is the key to keeping our loved ones safe. We've seen heartbreak, experienced loss, and we want nothing more than to shield those we care about from the same pain we've endured. But in doing so, we sometimes forget that true love is not about control, it's about trust. This story reminds us that the most precious gift we can give our children, our grandchildren, and even ourselves is the freedom to grow. No matter how much we want to protect them, we must allow them to discover their own paths, make their own mistakes, and uncover their own joys. Every step they take, whether it's graceful or clumsy, teaches them something valuable about who they are. And sometimes, in watching them grow, we end up learning just as much about ourselves. It's never too late to learn that strength comes from vulnerability, not avoidance. Many of us were raised to believe that showing emotions was a sign of weakness, that holding everything inside was the mark of maturity. But the truth is, being open, admitting when we're afraid, and sharing our feelings is one of the greatest acts of courage. Just like Matteo found his voice through dance, we too can find our voice, whether it's through stories, conversations, or simply allowing ourselves to feel again. Another beautiful reminder from this story is that healing doesn't follow a schedule. Loss leaves wounds that don't always close neatly, no matter how much time passes. But healing often comes in unexpected ways, through a new passion, a gentle hand offering guidance, or even a second chance at something we thought we had lost forever. Life has a way of circling back, giving us opportunities to reconnect with the parts of ourselves we thought were gone. If there's one message to take away, it's this: it's never too late to embrace joy again. Whether it's through learning something new, reconnecting with an old passion, or simply opening your heart to those around you, every day offers a new chance to dance in whatever form that takes for you. Maybe it's dancing with your grandchildren, or maybe it's sharing stories from your youth that you've never told before. Whatever it is, don't let fear or regret keep you from stepping into the light. If this story touched you, we invite you to like this video, leave us a comment sharing your thoughts or personal stories, and subscribe to our channel to hear more stories that speak to the heart. And if you know someone who might need a gentle reminder that it's never too late to embrace life again, please share this video with them. Together, we can remind each other that life's most beautiful moments often come when we least expect them.